is a story associated with the Christian Reformed Church's consideration of the Belhar. It first came to our attention at the request of ecumenical organizations in the late 1980s, when we were asked to respond, that is, the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church was asked to respond to this question: can the Belhar Confession, or should the Belhar Confession, be added to the constitution of the ecumenical organization that we were part of at that time, the Reformed Ecumenical Synod? The Synod of the Christian Reformed Church in 1990 affirmed the appropriateness of that and authorized its Ecumenical Relations Committee to convey that message to the Reformed Ecumenical Council. And Synod, in effect, though not an exact quote, said, "We have no objection to it being added to the constitution of an organization we ourselves helped form in 1946, because the Belhar is consistent with the Reformed confessions and teaches important lessons for the Church of today." The Belhar Confession does come out of a historical experience in South Africa particularly, and that is to say, that is where it emerged, that is where it was born, that was where it was crafted. But if you think about the themes of the Belhar, or even the South African experience, then the Belhar is not different from any other confession, which each has its own historical context in which it was written. It was in the process of being engaged by others about the Belhar Confession, and then through my own personal study and involvement in our Ecumenical Relations Committee, and eventually being asked to do the listening in the church about the attitudes towards it, that I became convinced, and actually I needed to become convinced, that the Belhar Confession is an important statement of faith that would enrich our confessional basis in the Christian Reformed Church by its adoption.
Initially, when I began to engage the Belhar, I had some skepticism. It's a relatively young document. It comes out of a very different culture than my own. But that skepticism was overcome by watching how the Belhar was impacting what was happening in Southern Africa, but even more so how I saw a potential for the Belhar to impact North America and the way in which we address issues of justice, of racism, of diversity, and of how we become reconciled to one another.
What was monumental for me was that the group of people who wrote it were people of color, and they were oppressed, and they themselves were divided at some point. And then this group of people of color came together to write this document to present to the larger body of Christians who happen to be white, who in the past were their oppressors. And so people of color called their brothers and sisters, called the church into account. And oftentimes when we have talks about race, usually it's, in my experience, white people who are calling people of color to the table and even setting the table. But in this instance, the people of color came together and they set the table, and then they called the white people to the table. And that was empowering to me.
I see a lot of similarities with the apartheid that was present there, and how the people of South Africa were basically colonized and then made to be subservient to these immigrants who came into their land. In many ways, that is similar to what happened with our people. Our Navajo people have a history of the Long Walk, where the U.S. government came in and basically rounded us up and then marched us down to Fort Sumner and tried forcibly to assimilate us and to make us into Americans. That experiment failed so miserably that eventually my leaders were able to negotiate a treaty, and we brought us back to our land where we now live, which has been established as a Navajo reservation. And while we have not in modern times experienced as much of the injustice in regards to apartheid as was the situation in South Africa, our history is in many ways similar to the history of what happened to the people of South Africa.
My own personal journey with the Belhar Confession actually started when I met with a pastor, a black South African pastor in South Africa, who was also serving as the justice coordinator for the Christian Reformed World Relief Committee, and I was working as the team leader at the time. And he seemed quite animated one day about this Belhar Confession and talking about how it was significantly uniting the uniting Reformed churches of South Africa and the Dutch Reformed Church, and especially around the whole concept of diaconal ministry. Later on in that trip, when I was with another black South African pastor and evaluating the work that we were doing, I heard some more stories from this man about how even though apartheid had been abolished in policy form from the government, there were still remnants of pain and injustices that were still there and needed to be addressed. And he really felt like the Belhar Confession was one way that the church could finally significantly address some of those injustices. And this man explained to me, even in his own family history, how his family had large tracts of land, and these had been taken over by white South Africans at that time, Dutch immigrants, and how even to this day they know where that land is, and they as a people feel that it is rightfully theirs. And these are some of the issues that the church there still has to grapple with, and the Belhar Confession calls them to do just that. And when I reflect on that, I realize it's not just a South African issue. Each one of us in our churches and in our communities can be proponents of injustices in the way that we look at the assets and resources that we have, the way that we hoard them for ourselves and try to dominate others for our own gain. And for me, the Belhar Confession calls us back to a deep soul searching of who we are and what really it means to be a Christian and to put things right before God.
My journey with the Belhar Confession really has been a journey. When I first saw it, I was a little skeptical. I wondered, do we need this as a fourth confession? What will this do to our ecumenical partners? The context that the Belhar Confession was written in is so different than ours. But the longer I journeyed with it, the longer I read it and studied it and prayed over it and talked to other people about it, I came to understand that this is really tremendously relevant for us today. I began to understand that our ecumenical partners are churches in the global south, people who and churches who are asking us to adopt this. And I began to see that it speaks powerfully to our life here in North America.
I was sitting in my first synod in the summer of 1989 as the Christian Reformed Church was debating the issue of breaking ties with the Dutch Church of South Africa. And in that discussion, it was about, did we see apartheid as a sin? Hearing the conversations that were going on between elders and ministers, very heart-wrenching, because these were brothers, these were sisters who had a theological affinity with one another. And I remember sitting there and just a turn in my stomach of where that was going. And I wanted to be a part of the Christian Reformed Church. And now, as I was so happy to hear that they broke those ties, but I was also puzzled and saddened of why this discussion even really happened, and why did it take so long. I felt that I was a part of something larger, but at the same time that this was a struggle. And I felt that struggle, and it was a painful struggle.
The sin of racism still exists, and the church has had a role to play in how racism has played out in our country, in our denomination, in our churches, in our communities. The church plays a role not only in trying to dismantle the effects of racism and eliminate those causes and effects, but it also plays a significant role in promoting the kind of unity, the kind of reconciliation, the kind of justice that we are called by God to exhibit, bringing hope to people. And so I think it's very important for the Christian Reformed Church to consider the Belhar Confession.
My position on the Ecumenical Relations Committee of the Christian Reformed Church of North America gave me the opportunity to engage more deeply in the discussion of the Belhar. It was about that time that the Christian Reformed Synod asked the Interchurch Relations Committee, which is now the Ecumenical Church Relations Committee, to take a deeper look at the Belhar Confession and lead the denomination into a deeper engagement of that confession, to evaluate its biblical background and stance, and to eventually come with a recommendation in terms of what our denomination ought to do with that confession that arose in South Africa.
I first learned of the Belhar Confession when I was a seminary student. I went to Western Seminary, which is the Reformed Church seminary, and they are having a similar conversation to what we're having in the CRC. I learned about the Belhar in the context that I learned about all the other confessions. And it helped me to understand why the other confessions that we have in our tradition are also so important. They had felt so antiquated, I guess, and so far back in our history, and sort of like relics to me, until I interacted with the Belhar, which seemed to me to be so prescient to what was going on in our time right now. And so that's when I really began to understand why it was that we were a confessional church and why the confessions were so important to us. I heard about the Belhar for the first time from my professor, Jaco Hamman, who was from South Africa and had his own really unique journey with the Belhar Confession, being Afrikaans. And he helped to point out that the Belhar was uniquely a voice from below, that God had been speaking to people who had gone through such oppression and such incredible trial, and that God had been working through His Holy Spirit in those people in order to raise up this beautiful voice of unity and reconciliation and justice.